Chapter 17, the Industrial Revolution. So we're going to start this chapter by talking about the origins of the Industrial Revolution, which took place in Great Britain. We'll talk about stage 2 of industrialization from 1860 to 1914, what life was like for those in industrial societies, and then the effects of all of these changes with labor movements and socialism, and then ultimately new patterns of urban life. The Industrial Revolution in Britain, 1700 to 1860. So, an indicator of human progress is technological improvement. And most of the time, we now associate industrial development and technological improvement with the West, with the United States, with Europe. But early on, the most advanced civilization in pre-modern times was China under the Song dynasty, which ruled from 960 to 1279. And they had high culture, painting and poetry. They had figured out new ways to grow crops. They had paper money, extensive canals. They had silk, ceramics, lacquer, and book production, advances in iron. So early on, it was really the East, or China specifically, that led the way in technological improvement. However, in the 18th century, the West caught up with and eventually surpassed China. And the Industrial Revolution began with a few new machines and eventually brought in multiplied profits of business classes and pretty much restructured production altogether. And so it's important to note that this began in Great Britain in 1700, and in the 150 years after that, Britain pretty much mechanized the textile industry, created a railway network, and launched a fleet of steamships. And it all began with the Agricultural Revolution. So the Agricultural Revolution was prompted by a few new tools. The first one was the seed drill, and this was invented by Jethro Tull, not the band. But the seed drill replaced seeding by hand with systematic, mechanized, evenly planted rows. He also invented the horse-drawn hoe, which was an iron plow that could be set at an angle that would pull up grasses and roots and leave them to fertilize the land. So there were a couple of new tools that paved the way for this revolution in agriculture. Another one was that peasants began to pay fluctuating rents based on how the economy was doing, how their crops were doing, rather than fixed rents, meaning you will always pay this amount no matter what the economy does. So that was replaced with fluctuating rents. On top of that, the Enclosure Act closed down community public lands that were used for grazing sheep and cattle, and those lands were sold to private owners for private property to make private profits. So from 1714 to 1801, about 25% of the land in Great Britain was enclosed. On that land, though, investors made quick money. This was seen as an agricultural investment. But subsistence farmers who depended on that land to feed their livestock were reduced to tenant farmers and wage laborers. And as a result of that, peasant riots broke out. And there was one riot where 3,500 people were killed. Some people did turn to industry, like working in factories, to try to supplement their income. But overall, these enclosure acts were devastating to some people. And as a result, economist Joseph Schumpeter called capitalism, quote, creative destruction. Okay, so revolution in textiles. So prior to the textile revolution, Great Britain imported their cotton from India, and eventually it would be imported from the United States and Egypt, and manufactured at home, which was good because it provided jobs and profits and cut back on buying finished cloth from India. But they did this through what was called the putting out system. The putting out system. And the way this worked was that manufacturers dropped off cloth at their workers' homes, and then they would come back on Saturday to pick it up and would pay them for this work. And this was good for families because families could work together on these projects, and they were in their homes instead of in a factory. Some of the inventions of the textile revolution included the flying shuttle. This was invented by a guy named John Kay. And John Kay's invention allowed one weaver, instead of two, to shuttle the loom from left to right and then back again without a second operator. Another invention was the spinning jenny, and this was invented by a guy named James Hargreaves. And you may have seen these names before if you took world history in 7th grade. But the spinning jenny allowed operators to spin several threads at one time. For instance, the earliest one could spin or run 8 threads at once. But a little bit later, by 1770, they could run 120 threads at once. Another important invention was the water frame, invented by Richard Arkwright. And this machine was powered by water and could run continuously and would spin several cotton strands at one time. Also, the spinning mule, invented by Samuel Crompton. This is actually Samuel Crompton combined the spinning jenny and the water frame for higher quality cloth. And then lastly, the power loom, which was invented by Edmund Cartwright. This used water power to drive the shuttle. And so all of these inventions really made it so that it was so much easier to have textiles produced at home, pretty much. On top of this, the development of the steam engine really spurred this revolution in textiles. Just a little bit of a background here. In Great Britain, earlier on, coal miners or coal mine owners were looking for a better way to pump water out of the shafts. And so Thomas Newcomen in 1712 used steam to drive these water pumps. And then in 1763, James Watt perfected this and manufactured the first steam engines. And from this point on, machines grew more and more sophisticated. I'm going to minimize this because we have more writing to do. So Arkwright even switched to the steam engine in the 1780s. All of this transformed Great Britain's economy. And, 100 pounds of cotton yarn took 50,000 hours to produce in India. But with Arkwright's steam-powered frame, 100 pounds of cotton yarn only took 300 hours. So 50,000 hours versus 300 hours. That cut production time down so much. So in 1791, home-based workers began to riot, and they began to destroy factory machines because it was messing up their putting out system. The Luddites, this is one of the groups that did this. The Luddites, they were named for their leader, Ned Ludd, who was mythical, demanded a complete ban on new machines. And then the soldiers had to come to crush that rebellion. In the United States, they used slave labor and, of course, Eli Whitney's cotton gin to produce raw cotton to fuel Great Britain's factories. So despite the efforts of people like this, it did not put an end on machines or a ban on machines in factories. In fact, this industry only continued to grow. So that brings us to the iron industry. About 1775, the iron industry relocated to the coal and iron fields of the English Midlands. And there was a guy named Henry Court who began the process of stirring molten iron ore at high temperatures. And they were then melted, hammered, and rolled into bars. And their productivity increased dramatically. Railroad tracks, locomotives, and steamships all depended on iron. And so George Stephenson built the first reliable locomotive called the Rocket because it went a staggering 16 miles per hour. But soon after that, tracks and locomotives sort of swept across Europe. And then steamships were invented around the same time by Robert Fulton, who started with the Clermont. Industrialization stage 2. And the thing that distinguishes the second stage of industrialization is steel, chemicals, and electricity. Those are the three things that characterize stage 2 of the Industrial Revolution. So starting with the steel and chemical industries. It was the Bessemer process that allowed iron to cheaply be converted to steel. Even if you melt iron at high temperatures, there are still impurities. But with the Bessemer process, steel production involved ridding the impurities first and then adding carbon to iron ore to make it stronger. And just as a side note, Germany actually outpaced Great Britain in steel production by 1900 because of Otto von Bismarck. The chemical industries, grew after 1870 as well. Many synthetic substances, mainly derivatives from coal, replaced natural ones. Alkalis and dyes from vegetables. With the chemical industry, dyes were made from coal tar, and explosives and fertilizers were made from synthetic nitrogen and phosphates. And fertilizers fueled the agricultural revolution. And of course, explosives helped create new tunnels through the Alps and the Suez and Panama canals. Not to mention new drugs and insecticides, perfumes, cosmetics, plastics became available in the late 1800s. So this was all a result of the chemical industry. And then electrical inventions. In 1831, Michael Faraday in Great Britain demonstrated the principle of electromagnetic induction. And this is the production of an electromotive force across a conductor when it is exposed to a varying magnetic field. I won't lie, I don't know what that means, but it was very important for electrical inventions. By the 1850s, many companies were producing simple electric generators, and this is basically turning mechanical energy into electrical energy. Nikola Tesla, it's a big one, worked with Edison for a while, invented methods to transfer power over long distances. He patented the alternating current generator in 1892. And then not to mention Edison himself with the light bulb, inventing fuses and sockets, breakers, switches, etc. And many would argue that his most important invention was actually the Industrial Research Facility, because it institutionalized the process of invention, new products, and new producers. So the second half of the Industrial Revolution corresponded with the era of big business. And there were these cartels that were pretty much monopolists. They were an association or a group of independent producers or businessmen who wanted to control an industry. If they controlled it as a group, they could regulate the industry and then increase prices how they wanted to. The artisan, like the guy in his shop with maybe one or two employees, the idea of a craftsman or an artisan, that was displaced by mass production and mass consumption. Another new product and producer, warfare and industrialization went hand in hand. Samuel Colt's revolver to Hiram Maxon's gun that could fire up to 1.5 miles. So all of these were new products produced by new businessmen. And then worldwide effects of the second stage. Financiers, people who had made a ton of money, were looking for investment opportunities. They were constantly trying to look around the corner and see what was going to be the next big industry so that they could invest in it. and make a lot of money. And Great Britain was really good at that. They became the largest investor. The United States as well, and as a result, immigration to the Americas increased dramatically. The United States actually became the most industrialized nation, and Canada was up there as well, attracting many immigrants and enjoying self-government within the British Empire. Russia even sort of made it on the map. They produced lots and lots of steel, more than Italy or France. And this was just the age of finance capital. Finance capital was in full swing, and that's just the upfront money needed to fund a new industry. There were people who had made a ton of money in the Industrial Revolution and were looking for a way to spend it. And so that came through investment opportunities. So we'll go ahead and end our video lecture there.